We are now going to ABC News for some national news of note and a tragic night for the ABC family.
Good life, end quote. Peter's family's strength, caring, and love have sustained and comforted Peter over recent months. And with him as well were the prayers and the love and the great respect of all of us at ABC News who worked with Peter during his 41 years here. But it was not just those of us who worked with him who felt such a personal bond with Peter. Since he courageously told everyone of his cancer in early April, there has been an outpouring of emails, gifts, letters, expressions of support, and just plain good wishes from viewers that overwhelmed everyone here, but most importantly, overwhelmed Peter and gave him great strength. It was simply a virulent and terrible form of lung cancer that Peter faced. He was a man of iron will. He was, as anyone who competed with him on a story will tell you, fiercely competitive, and he had an enormously strong constitution, all qualities that served him well. He put up a tremendous battle with this disease. During his illness, the good news was he would often call in with suggestions, comments, and criticisms about a World News Tonight broadcast. His involvement in World News Tonight, the program that he loved so deeply, was considerable right up until the last days of his life. Peter did it all. He reported from every corner of the globe. No one in this business understood events overseas better than Peter. There is probably not a world leader of any consequence in the past 35 years that he did not interview. Whenever there was a major event in the world on which to report, Peter reported it. It is virtually impossible to properly summarize the career of a man who did so much over so many years. However inadequate to the task, we have tried.
News Tonight with Peter Jennings, this evening reporting from Washington.
Good evening. The fate of Korean Airlines Flight 7 continues to anger, but
he was our anchor, our mainstay. Off the air as well as on, Peter could transform confusion into clarity.
And keep you abreast of what's been going on.
And make the exercise appear effortless.
We are going to stay on the air until NASA tells us what it knows.
He set standards for us, and he never stopped raising them as he helped audiences understand the major events of our time.
Someone actually reached up and handed me a small piece of the wall that they had chipped away. It's those small moments that make up this extraordinary day.
ABC News President David Weston, in a tribute, wrote, "The void Peter leaves cannot be described, but as much as we miss him, Peter Jennings will always be with us at ABC News, in our history, in who we are, in what we do, in the stories we care about." Peter's own story here at ABC spanned more than 40 years, and it encompassed both a unique era in broadcasting
10 seconds. Quiet, please.
And the extraordinary parallel story of a young man who made a stunning comeback from his own premature success.
Violence is not a problem peculiar to any one particular area of the country.
Peter was a Canadian, born in Toronto. His father, Charles Jennings, was a prominent radio news reporter and anchor there, and Peter followed him into our business. At the age of 9, Peter was already hosting his own weekly children's radio show.
Was it your boyhood ambition to always be in broadcasting?
Without question.
It was.
In the top of the news, a cold-blooded killing.
He dropped out of high school for a full-time radio job because he was so passionate about working in broadcasting. Also, he said, because at the time he was bone lazy.
A view from Canada from Peter Jennings.
There was something about him and his poise on the air.
The Meredith March began in Memphis, Tennessee 3 weeks ago. And
ABC noticed his work in Canada and hired him as a correspondent in 1964. One of his assignments was covering the civil rights movement in the South.
At about 1:15 this afternoon, a lone Negro came down and tried to enter the Les Dramatics cafeteria.
We can't take the 10-second roll from the 10-second.
Then, in an extraordinary move that said a lot about the desperation of a third-place news division on a third-place network, Peter was made anchor of ABC's evening news when he was only 27.
2, 1.
Peter Jennings with the news.
Good evening. Konrad Adenauer is dead.
And said, Peter, I want you to come back and take over the 6 o'clock show. And I gather he was startled, and he said, you're kidding.
He said at the time, ABC was into kids programming like Gidget. And Peter joked, I think everybody said, let's go kids across the board. Even then, he had a sense of humor about it.
No makeup out of the eyes. I won't let the makeup man make up underneath my eyes because I've begun to develop, just very slight sort of 27-year-old bags under my eyes, and I think, aha, you see, I'm beginning to look a little more distinguished, a little more convincing.
And with clear foresight, Peter was already hedging his future possibilities.
I'm young enough, if I blow it, I can go back and start all over again.
That is exactly what he had to do. The experiment didn't work. America wasn't ready for an anchor so young. That failure, however, helped define who Peter would become.
We cannot see them, but we can certainly hear them. Israeli helicopters.
It also formed the core of the advice he gave to every young reporter to do what he did in 1968, become a foreign correspondent.
The great beating of their blades, indicating without a shadow of a doubt that the Israeli operation in this area of the Arqub in South Lebanon on the slopes of Mount Hermon is definitely continuing.
Peter went to the Middle East, established the first American television news bureau in the Arab world, and spent 10 years becoming a world-class reporter.
This is Peter Jennings, ABC News in the Golan Heights.
There is nothing so constant in the Middle East as the sight of refugees.
Those of us close to Peter know he remained sensitive about never finishing high school. But he compensated for it by becoming a student of the world.
I lived in the Middle East for a long time, and the one thing I learned after living there was that there is no one absolutely essential truth for all people. And that every time I look at a coin, I instinctively want to look at the other side.
We interrupt this program to...
When terrorists took Israeli hostages during the 1972 Munich Olympics, Peter immediately brought a context to the coverage that came from his years of experience.
Peter Jennings is inside the village. Let's go to Peter now.
If I were to guess at the moment at which of the commando organizations this group is to come from, I'd be most likely to narrow in on a group called Black September.
We happened to hit right where Peter lived.
Rune Arledge, Peter's future boss at ABC News, was then executive producer of the Olympics.
And when you're talking about Al Fatah and Black September and these things which were alien concepts to most Americans, and certainly to most of the people working on the Munich Olympics, Peter knew all of that.
One of the histories of the Palestinian operations like this is a history of failure.
And he gave the viewers of the Olympics a dimension that they just had never had before.
Israel and the Arab countries is like one of the evil pendulums of history, which just goes back and forth and back and forth.
As anchor of World News Tonight, Peter said again and again that context, why something happens, is what's truly important to us.
Well, there is something that every Lebanese man and woman fears more than any shelling. It is the car bomb.
His experience in the field had given him a broad sense of history, and he used the broadcast to apply it to daily events and to give them deeper meaning.
Just one picture will tell you how wretched man can be to his fellow man. There was this wounded girl, and there were at least 14 people killed. Now, I decided that on that one day, we would just stay with that little girl. I then got a lot of letters from people. The phone ran off the hook. Some people said, how can you do that at the dinner time? Our children are watching. What do you do? I don't really know what you do. There's so much violence in our lives and so much violence in our world that I don't think people think about violence. I don't want to be in a position of sanitizing the news. This is called, I think, the secret garden.
Peter also brought his knowledge into his decades of interviews with world leaders on issues that were timeless.
Is there, in fact, no way in which Israel can have the security it requires and you can have the honor you demand?
And some that cut straight to the headlines.
Will you release the hostages, and when will you release them? Overseas today, here in London and also in other world.
Peter had begun anchoring again in 1978 when he moved to London and became part of a three-man anchor team that included Frank Reynolds in Washington and Max Robinson in Chicago.
Israel says today it shot down 22 Syrian fighter planes.
5 years later, in 1983, he returned to New York to become the sole anchor of the broadcast.
2 more Americans, 1 Marine and 1 Seabee have been wounded in Beirut.
The job that lasted the rest of his life. It was also the beginning of a new phase of discovery for Peter, discovering America.
We've come to Detroit for 2 days to focus on jobs and the American worker and what the American...
And he set about it with the same dedication he'd applied overseas, but he had to learn fast. His U.S. election night coverage in 1984, just after returning from Europe, was shaky, by his own admission.
Peter, in Minnesota, we did call the Senate race of Rudy Boschwitz a Republican.
Yeah, I meant to say president.
Right.
I say Senate.
The president we have not.
Co-anchor David Brinkley wasn't even sure I knew who the faces belonged to, said Peter. And he was right.
We're joined in our election headquarters now by Dr. Henry Kissinger, former national security advisor to President Reagan.
I don't want President Reagan to have a heart attack. I was not security advisor to President
I beg your pardon,
Reagan.
President Nixon, you're quite right.
So Peter dedicated himself to learning American politics.
Governor Clinton went out and forced President Bush to campaign where he did not early on expect he was going to have to. David, you've got some Senate calls, I think.
I do indeed, Peter.
Throughout the years, said one producer, Peter didn't go to parties. He stayed in his room and studied the loose leaf binder that was crammed with details about issues and candidates.
Dan Quayle. Where is he? We haven't seen him.
Well, today he went back to his hometown dentist to get his teeth cleaned. How long?
2 minutes.
In the newsroom, Peter's enthusiasm was palpable to all of us and contagious. The job was always an adventure to him. He once tried to remember when he'd been bored and decided it was never more than for half an hour at a time.
Very often we come upon people making a difference in quite
Stories are essentially about people, and that the best way to tell other people about what's happening is through the lives and the attitudes of people you encounter.
Live from around the world, a celebration of the millennium.
Peter could also scare the hell out of a lot of us. Before we scattered around the world to cover the coming of a new millennium, Peter came up with questions, and more questions for each reporter at each location. And he expected everyone to know the answers. He made it one of the most exhilarating live broadcasts ever devised.
Happy New Year to you all across the country. We're going to try to share this extraordinary occasion with much of the rest of the world. And
with the advent of international television, we all share in each other's experiences. And that means that it has an impact on all of our attitudes. I think that's when I feel, A, that I have a very big responsibility, and I also think that's when I feel really great about what I'm doing.
He invoked the words of Martin Luther King Jr. when he said, "Let freedom ring," and this is what it looked like. The government has now shut down the entire air traffic system in the United States.
On 9/11, he used every ounce of his reserve. Many viewers and many of us who worked with him thought that his unforgettable presence, sifting through the chaos, measured and straightforward, was his finest hour.
It is a tragedy that has revealed itself before the eyes of millions of people in the country watching on television.
The worse things get around me, the cooler I tend to be. I tend to focus very hard under pressure.
Well, scene that's been repeated hundreds and hundreds of, maybe, as far as we know, thousands of times.
But I have indeed lost it on television. I almost lost it a couple of times on 9/11. Most specifically, when I turned around to find that my children had called from two parts of the country, I think it made me think of a lot of families and their children. I checked in with my children, and who were deeply distressed, as I think young people are across the United States. And so if you're a parent, you got a kid in some other part of the country, call them up.
In May of 2003, partially because of 9/11, he said, and partially because of a book he was writing, In Search of America, Peter Jennings finally became an American citizen.
Unlike any other nation in the world, America is an idea.
That I will support and defend.
We are a nation of immigrants, I'm one of them, who have come here because they believed in the ideas and could somehow contribute to the ideas and be themselves in ways that you couldn't be quite anywhere else.
So help me God. So help me God.
You could know Peter well and still be amazed at what he would do next. He had faith, when many others did not, that millions of Americans would tune in for a 3-hour documentary seeking historical truths about the life of Jesus.
What was the status of Jesus' movement at this point? Did he have a great many followers?
I don't think he had.
Subjects like this one didn't lend themselves to an evening news format.
But as Jesus was growing up here...
So Peter extracted a commitment from the network to investigate those topics in primetime documentaries. He reported on the continuing U.S. involvement in the military conflicts in Southeast Asia after the Vietnam War.
They get much of their aid from the United States, most of it secretly.
He explored Little League Baseball as a means of understanding the hopes and dreams of Americans.
I see great things in baseball, said the poet Walt Whitman. It's our game, the American game.
but we have provisions.
He also sought to confront issues in which he felt government had failed to protect its citizens, including one with which he was personally familiar, the most preventable public health problem in the country, smoking.
In the 6 years since the McCain bill failed, the Congress has not passed a single piece of tobacco control legislation. And 2.5 million more Americans have died from smoking.
Peter had smoked most of his adult life. In the 60s, it wasn't unusual to see cigarette smoke rising from his anchor desk while he was on the air. He quit in the mid-80s, but admitted relapsing during 9/11.
From ABC News World Headquarters in New York.
On April 5th of this year, he made an appearance on World News Tonight to explain why he had been absent from that show and from recent international events that we all knew he would otherwise have insisted on covering. He had been diagnosed with lung cancer.
I've been reminding my colleagues today, who have all been incredibly supportive, that almost 10 million Americans are already living with cancer, and I have a lot to learn from them. And living is the key word. The National Cancer Institute says that we are survivors from the moment of diagnosis.
Despite debilitating treatments, Peter continued to make his presence felt through emails and messages and visits to the newsroom. He cared too much about the life he had pursued so intensely to pull back from it. And when he was resting at his home on Long Island on his birthday, July 29th, we, his colleagues, made sure he knew what we were thinking. He looked up and saw a plane and a banner with the wishes of all of us who wanted to have him back. As for how he viewed his role, Peter described it 40 years ago when he was still on the verge of an extraordinary career.
I'm fascinated by everything. There's just too much going on in too many places that I just daren't miss.
He meant every word, and then he lived it. And we will miss him.
You've been listening to the latest news from ABC Radio. This is Peter Jennings, ABC, New York.
And as we said, Peter Jennings died tonight of lung cancer. And I must tell you, from a personal standpoint, it is difficult to watch the pictures because his presence here as our leader and as our anchor was a given. And it is a shock to realize that he will not be here again.